Okay guys, this is Mr. Cannon again, and today we're going to be looking at the Gilded Age. This entire unit will be focused on the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age really refers to the period from around 1870 to 1900. It's a period of massive industrialization. It's the Industrial Revolution. The second part of the Industrial Revolution is actually a part of the Gilded Age. But the reason it's called gilded is that gilded is a thin layer of gold, but underneath you have all these imperfections. It actually was a term coined by a Mark Twain novel, but that's what the Gilded Age was. It was this thin layer of stuff that looked really good, but once you dove underneath the surface, you see all these problems. Industry brought a lot of great changes with it, awesome changes as a matter of fact, but it also brought in problems. And the Gilded Age is a time when those problems are not going to be addressed adequately. So underneath the surface of this good-looking new society, we have all these problems that are going to emerge, and so that's what we're going to focus on today when we talk about the Gilded Age. Let's start by talking about railroad expansion. One of the reasons that we're going to see industrialization grow so much during this period is because of the transcontinental railroad and transcontinental railroads eventually that connect the country and allow these new industries to sell their goods and move their goods across the country. So what the Transcontinental Railroad, the first one, did was it connected the east part of America, the eastern part, with the west. We weren't connected before by a railroad. And so the Transcontinental Railroad is going to do that. And you know the story of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, these two companies who are going to compete against each other to see who can lay the most track, and they end up meeting in the middle. Not in the middle, but they end up meeting at a place called Promontory Point, Utah, where they nail the golden spike that officially connects the country. It connects the East and the West. That's what the Transcontinental Railroad did. And of course, both those companies were, a lot of the workers that worked on the railroad out west were immigrants. Out in California, you had a lot of Chinese immigrants, and then moving from the east to the west, you had a lot of Irish immigrants. But the Transcontinental Railroad is going to connect the country, and you can see there on the map how important that's going to be, to have that connection where you can have cities connected to each other, where these industries can move their goods from one place to another, and this is going to allow the rise of big businesses. Now, the reason these railroads are able to thrive so much is that the government is going to grant land to these railroad companies to build these railroads. So in other words, it's not going to cost the companies as much money as it would have had the government not granted this land to them. And so basically the government's going to say, here's this land, we encourage you railroad companies to go out and build your railroad. So it's sort of subsidizing. The government didn't control the railroads, but they sort of subsidized the railroads and helped them to develop because it was in the best interest of the country to do that. And the picture there on the right is the first transcontinental railroad there that we just discussed, where they met at Promontory Point, Utah, and the golden spikes were laid on the last bit of track that connected the country. It's going to be these railroads that allow that industry to flourish. It's also going to connect the government to these railroads in a major way, as they did grant this land to the railroads to build on. The next thing we want to talk about is, in moving the country further out west and having more and more people go out west, we are going to see conflict with Native American peoples out in the west. Some of these Native American groups had already come into contact and had conflicts with the United States because they had been pushed from lands in the east out to lands in the west. But for a lot of the Native American groups out in the West, they had not really encountered Americans in large numbers. And that goes for tribes like the Sioux out there, the Apache, the Navajo, but especially the focus is going to be on the Sioux, because they're not going to appreciate at all the expansion of the United States onto their ground. And so it's going to cause conflicts. And the more and more railroads that are built, we're going to see the more and more conflicts that emerge between these groups, these Native American peoples, and the United States. The government, in order to keep its interests safe, both economically and to keep its people safe, they're going to move the military out west. If you've ever seen the movie, it's an old movie, but it's called Dances with Wolves. Dances with Wolves is about an ex-Civil War soldier, and after the war, he has to have work. Got all these people who have to have work, and so he finds work by staying in the military and going out west to protect people against the Native American groups out there. And in this particular case, he ends up falling in love with these Native American peoples and appreciates their culture. But in most instances, that was not the case. You had conflicts between the Native American groups and the U.S. military, and of course, those conflicts were not going to be won by the Native American groups. They did not have the weapons, they did not have the numbers to fight against the United States government. So 3 things are going to happen with Native American groups during this period. The first is that Native Americans could assimilate into United States culture, or in reality, we're talking about white culture. They could assimilate and become more like Americans, dressing and talking and acting like Americans, getting jobs like Americans. And for some Native American people, they did decide to go that route, and they did do that. A second option for Native Americans was to move onto reservations, basically being forced onto Native American reservations. And you can see there in the green on the map and the light green, those were Native American reservations that were set up in that 40-year period there. This was not a good solution here at all. I don't want you to make you think that this was a good solution for Native Americans. It was basically saying, hey, look, you want to continue to practice your culture, you have to practice it on this ground. And at any point, that ground could have been taken from Native American peoples. And then, of course, the third reaction of Native American groups was war. And that was, of course, the worst reaction, is those wars are going to kill large amounts of people. Primarily the Native American groups is going to kill them. And so we're either going to see Native Americans assimilate, many did. We're going to see them move on to reservations. A lot of them did that. And then some groups decided to fight. And you can see in the little bullseyes there, you can see the different battles that were fought throughout the plains especially, but out west, between Native Americans and the United States. Okay, another thing we want to talk about during this period is the Second Industrial Revolution. Obviously, we're going to have a period of rapid economic growth that's going to be thanks to a number of factors, primarily land, expansion of land, labor, workers. We're going to have more workers to do this work. Capital, money. We're going to have more money to being invested. Technology, that's a big one. Technology, just an example, the Bessemer process. That's technology. Henry Bessemer came up with a process to make steel quicker, easier, and cheaper. Well, that process was a technological advancement that a man like Andrew Carnegie, the man on the left there, he took that technology and used it to make lots and lots of money in the steel industry. And then, of course, entrepreneurship. You're going to have men like Carnegie on the left and John D. Rockefeller on the right who are going to take chances, and they're going to open businesses. That's called being an entrepreneur. For some of these entrepreneurs, it didn't work out, but for some of them, it worked out in a major way. And they're going to become millionaires and close to even billionaires during this period. If you go by today's money, they would be considered billionaires. We're going to see, because of this, the rise of big business. And the 3 biggest businesses of that day are going to be steel, oil, and railroads. Now, that wasn't the only industries in America. They weren't the only industries in America, but they were the big 3: steel, oil, and railroads. And that's going to lead to these men becoming very, very wealthy. Some of these men are called, some people viewed them as captains of industry. They viewed them as good for the American economy. They provided jobs. They were philanthropists, meaning that many of them gave a lot of their money away. An example of that would be like J.C. Penney. If you've ever heard of the store J.C. Penney's. J.C. Penney did what was called a reverse tithe. He made a lot of money in the late 1800s, and he's going to give away almost 90% of his money to charities and churches. That's called a reverse tithe. So he would be viewed as a captain of industry. On the other hand, a lot of people viewed these men as robber barons. And robber baron, of course, is a negative term. They viewed them as making their millions off of the plight of their workers, that many of them did not treat their workers well. A lot of these men are going to develop monopolies. And as we know, a monopoly is where you control the entire market, which is not usually a good thing. Competition is what is good. Competition drives prices down and makes service better. Monopolies, they can charge whatever they want to. And a lot of these men are going to build up monopolies. So depending on who you were in this society, you either viewed these men as captains of industry or you viewed them as robber barons. And it may have even depended on the man as to how you viewed them. In the case of Andrew Carnegie, who made his money in the steel industry, he became the wealthiest man in the world. Andrew Carnegie there on the left a lot of people are going to view him as a captain of industry because he was such a philanthropist. John D. Rockefeller also was a philanthropist. He made his money in oil. But a lot of people are going to view him as a robber baron because of the way he went about building up his company called Standard Oil. Standard Oil became sort of the model for a monopoly, for a negative monopoly. And Standard Oil eventually will be broken up by the government. But the idea here is that you have these men who are going to develop these companies into large businesses. This is the time when we're going to see, for the first time in American history, big businesses. You know, we think of businesses today. You think of Walmart and McDonald's and Coca-Cola and Nike, and we could go on and on and on. These big businesses did not happen. They weren't around until the Second Industrial Revolution occurred. Without the Second Industrial Revolution, you would not have had the rise of these big businesses. Everything would have been what we call mom and pop stores, where you sell just to your local community. But because of the Second Industrial Revolution and the railroads connecting the country, we have the rise of these big businesses where people can buy the same good in Columbia, South Carolina that they buy in Los Angeles, California, and buy the exact same good. And that comes about during this period. There was a definite belief in this time period that the government looked out for the interest of big business and monopolies. You can see there in the political cartoon that you have these big fat cats who are looking over Congress. You know, Congress is the lawmaking body of our country. They're the ones that are supposed to be in control of the laws. And yet the view, and probably rightly so, of this political cartoonist is that it actually wasn't Congress in charge of the country, but it was these big monopoly owners. You can see on their shirts it says trust, and a trust was a monopoly. That's all that was. Now, monopoly, just to review very quickly, is a business that controlled the entire market. That is illegal in America today, but it wasn't illegal back then. So for instance, if we had a monopoly today, let's use fast food for example, McDonald's could potentially be a monopoly if it controlled all the fast food market, and Hardee's and Burger King and Wendy's all went out of business, and there was no national fast food chain except for McDonald's. That would be a monopoly. We don't have monopolies today. They are illegal. The closest we've come recently to a monopoly was Microsoft. And in about 15-20 years ago, the government actually forced Microsoft to put money in their competitor. Microsoft controlled over 90% of all the software market. Well, Microsoft ended up putting money into Apple or Macintosh, which makes Apple products. And because of that, one of the reasons Apple got as big as it is today is because of that decision by the government that Microsoft could not be as big as it was. So monopolies are illegal today, but they were not illegal back then. And monopolies was used two methods back then to become monopolies. The first method, one of the methods they would use is called vertical integration. What vertical integration would do is it would create a system where you as a business would control other aspects underneath you to make your product. So for instance, if McDonald's was a monopoly, and it's not, but pretending that it was, McDonald's would go out and buy out all the potato manufacturers and beef manufacturers and bread manufacturers. In other words, every piece that would go into making their product, they would own those lower pieces. Okay, that's called vertical integration, and that's one way that monopolies worked back then. They would basically own every piece of the puzzle that would go into making their product. Another method that was used by monopolies was called horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is basically where you would, as a business, buy out your competitors. So if we use McDonald's as an example again, McDonald's would go in and buy out Burger King and Hardee's and Wendy's and Taco Bell. And even though they may keep the name Wendy's and Taco Bell, in reality, they would be all going to McDonald's products. Or McDonald's bottom line. So in other words, you can call it whatever you want to, it would all be McDonald's running it. And that's called horizontal integration. And that was a method that a lot of monopolies used. The government back then didn't really get involved in regulating businesses. And so during this period, that's why you had a lot of these monopolies develop. That's also why you had a lot of people that would see these big companies as robber barons, because they would basically control an entire market, and in controlling that entire market, it wasn't necessarily good for those workers or good for the consumer who was buying those goods. You can imagine if we had a monopoly today, let's say that Verizon is a huge company. Let's say Verizon was the only phone company that you could use to buy a cell service. Well, you can guarantee that service would be worse, and it would also be more expensive because it's the only service that any of us could buy. But thankfully, that's not the case. There is competition, so a company like Verizon has to stay on its toes and provide a better service and hopefully even lower prices because they have competition out on the market. It's going to take a movement of progressives, which we're going to learn about in a few chapters from now, to really bring down a lot of these monopolies. And Teddy Roosevelt, who is one of the lead progressives, is going to champion that, which is why he was known as the Trust Buster. But we'll talk about that in a few chapters. What you need to know for this particular unit is that monopolies did exist and the methods they used to exist. Some of these big business owners promoted two philosophies or two views. Now, not all of them promoted this, but you did have two views amongst a lot of these very wealthy Americans. The first is called social Darwinism. It was the idea of survival of the fittest in society. Now, if we go back to Darwin's theory, we know that in his theory, in nature, species survive by evolving, and that's how they're able to make it, and species that do not evolve or do not evolve correctly do not make it, and that's called survival of the fittest. The fittest make it. And this philosophy was actually being brought by some of these business owners into society, and they would say, look, Americans do better than the rest of the world because we are the fittest, we're the best. Or in the case of a big business, the reason my business is successful and your business is not is because I'm the fittest. It doesn't have anything to do with government policy. It doesn't have anything to do with luck. It doesn't have anything to do with anything else. It's simply survival of the fittest. And if there are people in society that are doing poorly, people that are struggling or maybe even in poverty, you know what? Too bad. This country's survival of the fittest. I'm fit, you're not, so that's too bad for you. And that was one philosophy that had emerged during this period. It was a way for big business owners to say to themselves, it's okay that I'm a monopoly. It's okay that my workers aren't being paid very much, because if they really want to, they can come and try to start a company on their own and become a millionaire like me. And if they don't, it's because they weren't fit enough or they weren't good enough to do it. Another view that was during this period was of laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire is a French word that basically means hands off. It means the government doesn't have anything to do with policies that promote one industry over another. It also would mean that the government should not get involved in regulating a business. Now, in reality, these businesses say they wanted laissez-faire capitalism, but they didn't. They would lobby the government. They would go to Congress and lobby Congress to pass tariffs that would benefit their industry. They would lobby the government to pass laws that would support them over the workers when the workers were trying to get things done, so they wouldn't have to pay workers as much or have to regulate their factories to make them safer. So they did. It wasn't like they really wanted the government to be hands off. They just wanted the government to be hands off on things that they didn't want the government to touch. But things they did want the government to touch, they were fine with them touching. And so that's sort of hypocritical for them to see it that way. Now, we still have a debate in America today about how far the government should go in the economy, but nobody, not any conservative or liberal, would view it that the government has no role in the economy. I think everybody would agree the government has some role. After all, we don't want rat sausage. We need to make sure we don't have rat sausage. But we still do have an argument about how much the government should be involved. There are plenty of people in America that believe the government is too involved in business and they regulate business too much. And that's certainly a view that many of you may have. And that is a valid point of view in America today. And then the other point of view is that the government should be more involved. There are people that would say that as well. That's a valid view as well. And we can debate those views, but no one would say we should go back to an era when there were no regulations at all. There should be some regulations, and the government should have some involvement. How much, that is up to your political opinions. Okay, we're also going to see during this period a pushback from farmers and from other groups in America, but especially farmers, who aren't seeing the same success as these captains of industry are seeing. Farmers, in fact, were not seeing much success at all. And a lot of it was due to positive changes in agriculture. Mechanization, for instance, is actually going to lead to poor conditions for farmers. Now, let me explain how this works. Mechanization is actually the growth of machines in producing goods. So you think about on farms things like tractors and eventually combines, things that have allowed us to grow more food in a smaller area and to be able to grow enough to feed the world. In fact, in just a small part of the United States, we can grow enough to feed the world. The positive of that, though, is going to lead to an oversupply of crops, because we're going to see farmers being able to grow more and more because of mechanization. This oversupply, as you know from economics, when you have too much supply, then the demand goes down. And that's going to result in lower prices, which means lower prices for farmers. But when farmers were getting these lower prices in whatever good they were growing, they decided, oh, the response should be to grow more of it next year. I didn't make as much money this year because the price was lower, so I need to grow more of it next year to make up for the lower price. But the problem was that meant the price was going to go even lower because there's going to be even more of an oversupply. And so the farmers during this period are not going to be doing so well. And so they're going to be looking at the industrialization going on and some of these big business owners making millions and millions. And they're going to say, wait a minute, the government should get more involved to help us out and quit worrying about these big business owners who are making millions of dollars. So we're going to see two things emerge here. The first is called the Granger laws, or the Grange, which were laws passed to look out for farmers. And the second is going to be the Populist Party. So you're going to have Granger laws that look out for the needs of farmers, and you're also going to have a political party emerge, both in the Republican and Democratic Party. There were elements of the Populists, but this Populist Party is going to emerge to look out for the common man and to look out specifically for farmers. The picture you see there, the painting, the cartoon there on the right, is a political cartoon of a candidate named William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan actually is going to be a congressman. He's going to be Secretary of State during World War I. He's a very famous politician, but he never is going to become president. He runs 3 times, but he never quite wins. One of the times that he runs, he's going to deliver a speech at the Democratic National Convention. And in that speech, he's going to give what's called the Cross of Gold speech, where he says the government is crucifying farmers and crucifying ordinary citizens on a cross of gold. What he meant by that, of course, that's a religious allusion to the cross in Christianity, but what he's referring to is the gold standard. Back then, all of our money had to, every piece of money that we printed, every dollar that we printed had to be backed by gold. The problem is gold, as you know, is limited. It's finite. And so you only have so much gold, which means you can only print so much money. And if you have these captains of industry making millions and millions, more and more money, that means there's naturally going to be less of a money supply for everyone else. And so what people like Bryan said is that we need to call for an unlimited coinage of silver. In other words, we need to add silver to our standards so that there can be more money printed, and perhaps, in that view, farmers and ordinary people can make more money, that their prices wouldn't necessarily be as low. Now, just to clarify, today we do not have the gold standard or the silver standard. Today our money is not backed by gold. Who determines how much money is printed is called the Federal Reserve System, and they do that through a number of things, looking at inflation and deflation and interest rates. You don't have to know that for right now, but just understand that our money no longer is backed by gold. So the populists are actually going to win a victory here, but at the time it was a big deal that all of our money had to be backed by gold. Now, this cartoonist who drew this actually is making fun of William Jennings Bryan. He's saying that William Jennings Bryan uses Christian images in a bad way. In other words, he shouldn't be using religious images to talk about things that are not religious. So he's sort of making fun of William Jennings Bryan there. But the point that I want you to get is that there were people out there, populists like William Jennings Bryan, who were pushing for things to change, the system to change, the government to get more involved so that farmers and other ordinary Americans could do better in this new industrial economy. The populists are not going to have nearly the amount of success in changing things as a new group will, who we'll talk about in a few chapters, and that group are called the progressives. But you do need to know the populists emerged during this period. Okay, another thing we want to talk about are labor issues that develop during the Gilded Age. As industry develops, we're going to have more and more work to be had in the cities. And so when more work is there to be had, you're going to have more and more people moving into the cities to find that work, including immigrants coming from other places. And these immigrants are going to be coming from primarily, they're coming from all over, but they're primarily coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the more and more people who come in looking for work, you're going to have an overabundance of labor. In other words, there were more workers than there was work. At one time, there was not. But as more and more people came to the cities looking for work, that's what it's going to result in. Too many workers and not enough work. And that's going to result in falling wages. So supply and demand is not only going to hurt farmers during this period, but it's going to hurt workers in the factories. You have workers who, if you can get a job, you're not going to be paid as much because there are plenty of workers to choose from. If there weren't plenty of workers to choose from, then wages would go up and these people could make more money. But instead, they're making very little money. And in fact, you had child labor during this period that had emerged, and children were especially paid very little. There are story after stories of young 10, 11-year-old girls who are working in these factories from before the sun comes up to when it goes down, working 12, 14-hour days and getting paid $1, $2, $3 for the week. It was really sad, some of the conditions. Workers are going to try to unite and form unions, and eventually they are going to form unions, but the first unions that actually develop are not very powerful. They don't have a lot of public support during the period to make a lot of headway. Now, that will come. There will be a period in the early 1900s where we're going to see more and more unions get more and more power, and things like strikes are going to work to get their demands. But during the Gilded Age, we're not going to see that. We're going to see unions really struggle to make any headway. So workers, wages are going to remain low. The conditions in these factories are not good. Health-wise, it's not good. You have people actually getting fingers cut off in some of the machines because there were no regulations on these factories. And so we're going to see this really be a bad time for the worker in America. It's not going to be a good time where wages are going to go up. Not yet, at least. That's going to come a little bit later.